This audio production was made in collaboration with Audible Anarchist.
Chapter 5: A Truly Different Future. Ecological Imaginations, Plotting a Total Transformation of Human Existence. A huge amount of resources have been spent to make it impossible for us to imagine a world free of capitalism, free of hierarchy, free of the institutions that originated in colonialism. As such, the only kind of imaginary that is articulated and practiced in dominant society is that of the technocratic engineer drafting blueprints onto a passive territory. One of the most potent weapons against such interventionism is situated imagining, looking at the world around us, tracing the relations we have and could have, listening to their needs, and giving those needs free rein to develop, to see what directions they pull us in. If you did not take your eyes off the page after reading that, do so. Give yourself a moment to understand what I'm really getting at. The world around us is not an abstract figure. It means the ground underneath your feet. It means the organisms that provide the air you breathe and the machines that poison it. It means the food in your pantry or refrigerator, the machines that gave it its present form, the land this food comes from, and perhaps other land much closer at hand from which it could come but does not, and the why of it all. Have you looked at the world around you yet? Do so. Stop reading. The stories of resistance in Chapter 3 all constitute proposals for resistance with immediate relevance, but they also suggest a horizon. What do we need to do to get to that horizon? Who are the people? What are the institutions standing in our way? What are the traumas and calcified social relations that make it excruciating to take even the first steps? And what will we have to do to heal those traumas and transform those power relations? Because we cannot accomplish what we cannot imagine, I will attempt to describe it not as a blueprint, but as an imagined future. The image is global, but not universal. I will focus on one territory that I know intimately, the one where I have lived for most of my adult life, in order to suggest a whole world made up of similarly empowered territories, each unique in how the crisis manifested there and how people came together to solve it. This section is also an invitation to a much larger book. It is a phantom book of unwritten imaginaries, all in dialogue. Each one of you is writing your own chapter from your own territory as you read on. Catalan countries. A few decades in the future, global capitalism has finally been dismantled, but we are still living with many of its effects. Global sea rise has already proven catastrophic in many parts of the world. Cities built on porous bedrock, like Miami, have suffered massive infrastructure failure and are being abandoned, while many Pacific island nations have been evacuated. The Catalan countries, despite their extensive coastline, have so far avoided the worst impacts of sea level rise, thanks to their mountainous topography and steep gradient at the coasts. On the other hand, a renewed relationship with the sea constitutes one of the primary responses to the ecological crisis. An end to commercial fishing trawlers, cruise ships, and oil and chemical tankers, as well as the phasing out of international cargo ships, have given the Mediterranean a much-needed chance to heal, all but eliminating chemical and noise pollution and halting the stripping of the seafloor. Kelp and seagrass forests have rebounded, spreading from small coastal preserves off the coast of Catalonia and Ibiza to replenish most of the littoral ecosystem. Much of this was spontaneous regrowth. With the destruction of dragnets, the seafloor was protected, and sea urchin overpopulation, which took its toll on the forest, was brought into balance as crab populations increased thanks to the decline in pollution. Also, the human tradition of consuming sea urchin, marginalized during the regime of capitalist food production, has experienced a major revival. In the traditional food cultures of the Catalan countries, Rosselló, Catalunya, the Balearic Isles, and Valencia, seafood was an important food source for coastal populations. The capitalist simplification of local food culture was carried out without any consideration for environmental impact. But now, food culture has been popularized again and is practiced with intimate knowledge of the ecosystemic balance. When people go to the beach, they often come back with a small basket of sea urchins to add to their supper. This provides a first example of a broader trend. Work and leisure, production and play are self-guided and indistinguishable. Gone is the alienation that separates work from life. Gone, too, is the more recent technological trend that had extended the logic of productivity to every moment of waking. In addition to creating the conditions for the regrowth of kelp and seagrass forests, human communities in the Catalan countries have carefully carried out several programs in which scientists have worked together with coastal communities in a relationship in which the latter have the final say. One was the reintroduction of the Eurasian otter, next to humans, the major natural predator of sea urchins, at specific coastal sites where it was determined they would have a viable habitat. Another was a collaboration between marine biologists and diving enthusiasts to plant new kelp and seagrass forests in locations where they were most likely to take, and that could also serve as bridges or stepping stones between remaining forests to increase the possible corridors for species movement and migration during a time of increasing instability. These practices have preserved marine biodiversity and saved several threatened species from extinction, improved the food security of coastal communities, established buffers against coastal erosion during the superstorms that will likely continue for the next couple of centuries, and through the exponential increase in marine forests, they constitute one of the main carbon sinks in the region, taking carbon out of the atmosphere as we slowly return to pre-industrial greenhouse gas levels. Another change in the human relationship to the sea involves seafaring. In the most intense years of the transformation, as effective state power waned, remaining fuel reserves were largely apportioned to international cargo ships, bringing emergency supplies to vulnerable parts of the world. This largely consisted of two things: food shipments to countries in the global south that had been forced into a dependence on imports, and machine parts so that poorer regions could attain self-sufficiency, producing food, medicine, and all other vital supplies. This global transfer of resources that allowed poor populations to leave the exploitative relationship of forced dependence was possible thanks to labor organization in the ports and factories. Despite decades of neoliberalism, labor organizing in the ports, not just in the Catalan countries, but around the world, remained remarkably strong, and especially in Barcelona, port workers tended to be highly solidaristic with other struggles. Additionally, the international crews of cargo ships were often from the very countries that were most vulnerable to a forced dependence on capitalism, and they had increasingly developed a solidaristic consciousness throughout the travesties of the pandemic and the failing global economy, as many crews were left to starve, abandoned on the high seas with years of unpaid back wages. It also helped that a large proportion of fuel reserves and processing facilities were located at or near ports, in easy reach of port workers. As for the factories, the Catalan automotive industry had already demonstrated its usefulness at a time when governments and capitalism were leaving people to die. At multiple locations during the pandemic, workers refused to shut down and instead repurposed their factories to manufacture respirators. International direct relationships of solidarity, which proliferated among grassroots movements but were illegible to the experts and technocrats, allowed for lines of communication between Catalan factory workers and cooperatives, urban assemblies, and peasant groups in the global south, from Senegal to Peru, to put out requests for specific machine parts and implements, like oil presses, tractor parts, and medical centrifuges, and to arrange for their shipment. It should go without saying that another vital move in the global redistribution of the means of survival was the immediate, total, and contemptuous abolition of that most odious of capitalist artifacts, intellectual property. All medicines, all scientific research, all machine blueprints, all code were immediately made universally accessible through illegal and forceful means, where institutions attempted to maintain exclusive access. Pharmaceutical factories that would not produce freely for everyone were expropriated. University faculties that would not share their research were set on fire. Previously unemployed art students made satirical busts of the putatively great inventors and researchers who had exploited research assistants, taken credit for traditional knowledge, or enclosed useful technology to grow rich while people were dying. The names of many who had expected to be remembered as great men in the annals of history were dragged through the dirt and will enter popular mythology as contemptibly greedy figures like the Grinch or King Midas. Territories that had achieved the autonomy to participate in the initiatives described above often reached self-sufficiency within a decade. The more territories that went down this path, the more the remaining networks of capitalist exploitation desiccated and dried up. The more remaining states lacked the resources and the support to obstruct or annihilate these initiatives, and thus the more other territories could reclaim their autonomy and defend one another against the attempts of capitalist and state institutions to maintain control. The process accelerated exponentially. From the perspective of those in charge, it was an apocalyptic collapse. For the rest of us, though not without extreme hardships, it was the greatest party we'd experienced. Our lives were our own for the first time. As more and more territories approached self-sufficiency, cargo shipments declined, coinciding with the decline in available fuel. The unwritten consensus within this growing network of empowered territories was to cap all oil and gas wells in a particular territory as quickly as technically possible, except in cases where doing so would lead to starvation. In such cases, the entire network was committed to helping the territory in question adapt its food infrastructure to shed dependence on fossil fuels. The obsolescence of container ships, however, has not meant that the seas have been vacated of a human presence. Quite the contrary, the seas and oceans are constantly crisscrossed with human craft, though below the waves a healthy silence reigns, with no more engine noises wreaking havoc on cetacean populations. Seacraft are wind-powered. Wherever coastal territories liberated themselves, people expropriated the large sailboats and yachts of the rich and quickly put them to emancipatory purposes. Before the revolution really got underway, the Catalan countries were already plugged into a nascent international anarchist sailors' union. This and similar formations related to the migrant solidarity and the reproductive freedom movements drastically increased their activity. Subverting the borders, moving climate and war refugees to safer ground, and supplementing the international shipments of vital supplies. Now, in this best possible future, after a few decades of revolutionary transformation, global shipping volumes are at only a couple of % of what they had been at the senescence of global capitalism. People still exchange goods globally out of pleasure rather than dependence, and since territories are self-sufficient, there is no logic of scarcity, and thus no need to regulate exchange within a monetary framework. Anyone setting sail from a Catalan port heading to Lapmi or southern Patagonia is sure to fill up their hold with oranges or olive oil. Such goods are abundant in the fields around Tarragona or Denia, and anyone who arrives with such treats in a temperate or subarctic latitude is sure to be a popular guest. This practice of distribution, though, does not resemble a quantitative exchange. Those unfortunate people who forgot are relearning that hospitality is something that should be offered to anyone who comes in peace, that generosity only creates more generosity. The interior of the Catalan countries have also experienced a radical transformation. Before the revolution really got underway, the population density was already near the limit of what might be sustainable, and a large part of the surface area was already covered in what technocrats considered forest. Turning these tree plantations into actual forests is a slow process, though an important one for decreasing atmospheric carbon. In some ecosystems, this means local communities help bring back local oak and beech forests that are fire resistant, promote more local humidity, and over time store a great deal of carbon in the forest floor as well as in the canopy. They also provide food sources to several animal species, enriching the food web in which local human communities take part. Acorn flour is also a great substitute in any year with bad cereal harvests. In ecosystems where pine forests are a better fit, this means shifting back to native pine species and making rigorous use of regenerative pastoralism, with goats and sheep keeping the understory clean and reducing the catastrophic forest fires that are one of the major dangers in our region. Wetlands sequester much more carbon than forest, and the old wetlands have been restored along all the major river valleys in the lowlands. The reality of catastrophic flooding made it easier to convince people to change houses in places where constructions had to be demolished to make way for recovery. One of the biggest projects was the near-total destruction of the Barcelona airport and the restoration of the wetlands it had been built upon. With the end of mass tourism and jet travel, only one runway was left for small planes. In the Balearic Islands, Local residents were ecstatic to reclaim their homes from the disrespectful hordes of tourists, and shutting down the airport to mass traffic was one of the first actions in the transformation. The piers where cruise ships docked were completely sabotaged to prevent any more from arriving and disgorging their unwanted passengers. During the most delicate years of the transformation, the Catalan countries were lucky to have a large amount of agricultural land and industries that could keep people fed while being repurposed, with enough surplus to send to more arid territories on the other side of the Mediterranean. One of the most dramatic changes was the abolition of industrial meat production. The factory farming of pigs had dominated much of the agricultural landscape, from the huge warehouses and slaughterhouses where the animals were consigned to miserable lives and deaths, to the sprawling monocrop fields dependent on pig slurry for fertilization, such that both plant and meat-based food products were integrated into the pig industry, as well as dependent on large injections of fossil fuels. Due to both the dramatic change in resource availability and a spreading ecological consciousness, industrial meat production was shut down with all haste. This also required a radical transformation of farmland. Any animal husbandry had to be integrated with either agriculture or forestry, such that farm animals did not place a demand on the production of grains, but largely fed themselves as they fertilized fields and maintained forests, living in herds and flocks under the open sky. Huge monocrop fields also had to become obsolete, as reliance on industrial harvesters, chemicals, and petroleum was neither desirable nor practical. Rural space experienced a significant repopulation, such that small gardens near houses have come to produce a large proportion of people's food. Large fields have been broken up and complexified, mixed with fruit and nut trees. Remaining cereal production is done on a smaller scale, harvested with tractors running on biofuels, or in a growing number of projects initiated by highly motivated young people through the recovery of older ecological technologies and hand tools. Meanwhile, artisanal rice cultivation continues in the wetlands of Tarragona and Valencia. The result is that the current agricultural system is self-fertilizing, creates a far more diverse and healthy diet, provides good habitat for many bird, reptile, amphibian, insect, and mammalian species, does not pollute, and in fact is carbon negative, in stark contrast to the earlier system. The shift on average of 30 to 50% of the urban population to small towns and the countryside is more complex than a simple transfer of people. In fact, affixing a percentage to static categories like urban or rural resident feels like an artifact of the sociological past, given how many people have one foot in the city and one foot in the countryside. Before state power collapsed, there was already a proliferation of anarchist and ecological initiatives recovering the practices and infrastructures necessary for an artisanal, primarily rural, and largely gift-based or solidarity economy. Thanks to these early waves, the models, tools, experiences, and territorial awareness already existed when people faced the need to carry out a rapid transformation of the existing agricultural system. With the abolition of police forces, and once the remaining fascist paramilitaries were defeated, there were no obstacles to occupying the abundant vacant housing units, a byproduct of runaway real estate speculation, fixing up old, abandoned macias or farmhouses, or expropriating the macias and vacation houses of the wealthy. Easy access to rural housing removed one of the greatest barriers and meant that artisanal and agricultural projects modeled on the anarchist experience could multiply 100-fold in a matter of years. These projects involve intense work, but a sort that is also joyous and healthy, in stark contrast to the farm work of the capitalist past, by small nuclei of permanent rural residents, often organized in queer families that abolish the patriarchal norms. However, again following radical traditions, these nuclei rely on broader networks of friends who come out from the cities at specific times of year, pruning, planting, harvests, both to help out and to enjoy the lavish feasts that always accompany such jornadas or workdays. Thus, a masía that might have 8 to 10 permanent residents can count on 10 to 30 friends who also consider themselves members of the project, to come up from the city and spend a few days sharing in the work and bounty. This tradition turns the most grueling moments of agricultural labor into occasions for celebration, as rural residents get to reunite with their semi-urban friends, and those friends get to enjoy the countryside and a form of labor that in small doses and as a contrast to their normal activity in urban workshops feels wholesome and rejuvenating. Curiously, a similar transformation took place among the old guard of the obsolete industrial agricultural economy. Losing access to fossil fuels and industrial fertilizers and pesticides in a relatively short time frame, they had neither the ability nor the know-how to cultivate their large tracts of land. Some of them voluntarily adopted ecological methods, both old and new, that had long percolated at the margins of the agricultural sector, whether preserved by traditionalists or introduced by starry-eyed city folk. But all of them were impressed by the necessity to keep farming to avoid social collapse, and all of them had to seek help in order to cultivate their lands without the noxious aid of petroleum and synthetics. So similar to the neo-rurals and anarchists, they called on their relations. In this case, it was cousins, nieces, nephews, children, and grandchildren who had gone to the city for university and never come back. These larger family networks provided the labor power necessary during key moments like harvests, and the returning youth also intended to erode the conservatism of the old guard of capitalist agriculture, from their patriarchal and xenophobic attitudes to their reticence to ecological practices. Such rhythms of residence mean that there is far less need to transport food, as more people live in food-abundant regions, and most food is produced in a small radius. The opposition between city and countryside, a source or an accomplice of many oppressive and state-forming dynamics throughout history, has largely been subverted, as the greatest number of people belong to both spaces. One struggle that lasted for years and left deep marks in rural regions was the push for racial justice. In the cities, lower-class solidarity during the revolt and the abolition of mass media have done a great deal to heal the wounds of racism and marginalize active racists. As for the members of the former upper class, they are all racists, whether of the progressive or reactionary variety, but they do not matter anymore, as they have been fully expropriated and discredited, and no one wants to hear what they have to say. But in the countryside, industrial farmers inhabited a peculiar borderland between capitalists and workers. They owned means of production and personally enacted the brutal exploitation of migrant workers, mostly racialized people. Yet they also worked the fields, were effectively owned by the banks, and tended to live on small margins. In most regions, there was little social support for expropriating family farmers. There was a major push by racialized people and those struggling alongside them to break out of the marginal position the broader society had long consigned them to. That meant access to good housing, which could generally be solved by expropriating the homes of the ultra-wealthy, vacation homes, or vacant units from the real estate bubble. It also meant access to land and food. In some cases, pressure from semi-urban family members succeeded in getting farmers who had exploited migrant labor to give up a part of their lands. In other cases, racialized people expropriated the lands of large agro companies with the support of neo-rurals who were already well established in a territory. Especially in the case of farmers who refused to address their exploitation of migrant workers under capitalism, there remain unhealed wounds that may last for another generation or two. Fortunately, the dominant culture in the cities and in a large part of the countryside is that racism is a value belonging to the old class of plutocrats who nearly got everyone killed. Fighting together in the streets against police violence, evictions, and precarity during the last years of the capitalist regime was key in developing feelings of anti-racist solidarity among the youth. That solidarity was key in the major migrations of the first decade of the transformation. Many immigrants who came to the Catalan countries in the last years of capitalism in search of jobs or fleeing wars chose to go home as communal solidarity economies flourished and wars ended. But many of those who came fleeing the consequences of desertification and ecological collapse, primarily from Africa, chose to stay, and climate refugees are still arriving. Though atmospheric carbon is now decreasing, and techniques for mitigating desertification have spread through the vulnerable areas, temperatures still remain more than 2 degrees centigrade over pre-industrial, and it is predicted that the climate will remain unstable for another century or two before settling back into the equilibrium of the late Holocene. Given that the Catalan countries are also experiencing desertification, the social movements had to make a big push to nip any anti-immigration discourses in the bud. Fortunately, in the final years of capitalism, solidarity flourished, as tends to happen in disasters. An extensive solidarity infrastructure was developed to help climate refugees get to territories that could support a larger population influx. This included technical aid in setting up agricultural communes in the Castilian interior, which had largely been vacated by capitalist agriculture, or more combative forms of support to accompany people who wanted to move to places like Germany and England, where rainfall was abundant, but a larger part of the population doubled down on racist positions during the transformation. In sum, the abolition of borders and states has allowed migrants and refugees to achieve a dignified survival in the Catalan countries, or to use these local territories as a stepping stone to get farther north. There is no central state stifling minority languages and peoples, as Spain had stifled the Catalans, Basques, and others. Without clear borders, and with a proliferation of familial and cultural links to neighboring territories, people come together in the case of conflicts, because society is simply no longer structured in a way that facilitates segmentation or incipient nationalism. Cities have also transformed significantly. One of the first changes was the multiplication of barricades as people protected themselves from failing state power. The barricades were connected to two subsequent transformations. The first was the proliferation of block assemblies that would become one of the most important units in the subsequent organizational structures, both cellular and federative, that allowed urban residents to reclaim space and shape the city according to their own needs, an impossibility under capitalism. The block assemblies were modeled on well-known earlier experiences of neighborhood assemblies, but at a smaller, intense scale, at which everyone could have meaningful participation. The neighborhood assemblies reappeared, but as federative coordinating spaces for the block assemblies, and themselves federated into a city-wide assembly. Nonetheless, block assemblies retained autonomy and in many senses had more power than the city-wide assembly, guaranteeing that city-wide infrastructure projects had to improve the quality of life for all neighborhoods, rather than establishing sacrifice zones as under the earlier regime. In this way, by locating power at the local level, the pyramid schemes of statist organizing were avoided. The second rapid transformation linked to the barricades was to make the city impassable to automobile transportation. Not only did the barricades themselves block roads, but the cars themselves were found to be more suitable construction materials for durable blockades, and the gasoline that fueled them was one of the most important resources for popular self-defense against a police force that was increasingly willing to kill anybody to preserve the privileges of their bosses. Both blocking and requisitioning cars, as it negatively affected the economically privileged classes and protected the lower classes, constituted an important symbolic shift, broadcasting that the city no longer belonged to the wealthy. It was also linked to a rapid decrease in the air and noise pollution that made urban living so hellish. Suddenly, the city became a joyous place of encounter, belonging to its own inhabitants. With the abolition of police, property titles were burnt, and everyone got access to adequate housing overnight. Even before the noxious hordes of tourists had fled, there had been more than enough vacant units. With property laws gone, artists covered the walls in murals, blunting the ugliness of bourgeois architecture. Major avenues were opened up to buses, organized workers kept the metro going, and neighbors made sure that all the small streets were fully passable for pedestrians, bikes, and wheelchairs. The next major concern was food. Before the supermarkets had been emptied out, volunteers from each block made contact with workers in the relevant industries to keep production and distribution going in the absence of a monetary economy, also accelerating the aforementioned tradition of mobilizing urban residents to help in harvests and planting. Most streets had half of their paving removed, uncovering the soil beneath. This was subjected to a season or two of fungal and vegetable bioremediation, cleaning up toxins from the capitalist city, and then planted with fruit and nut trees. The few vacant lots that had not already been transformed into urban gardens quickly were. Many neighbors started keeping chickens that pecked and scratched among the fruit trees, also keeping down insect and rat populations. Blocks organized compost collection in coordination with urban gardens and suburban farms, quickly paralleling the system that Kropotkin documented in the 19th century that provided Paris with most of its vegetables. Though many socially useless buildings were demolished early in the transformation, police stations, courthouses, jails, and prisons, City Hall, the demolition of excess and substandard housing was delayed until migration flows stabilized, and it became clear how many climate refugees would be coming from the Sahel. Once it was known how much extra housing there was, Neighborhoods prioritized the demolition of buildings on sites where it would be easiest to rehabilitate the soil and plant gardens. Within 2 decades, the cities were much more spacious, clean, and beautiful, and more than half of their food came from urban gardens and suburban farms. The rest came from agricultural projects directly supported by semi-urban residents. Another curious development to affect the cities was the appearance of youth neighborhoods. Surprisingly, the median age of many urban neighborhoods is 20 to 30. This is a result of most people 30 and older moving to small towns and rural projects, and their children, sometimes in their teenage years, moving to the cities for the educational, social, and cultural opportunities presented. To avoid conflicts with elderly neighbors or neighbors with small children, this youth migration tends to concentrate in a few neighborhoods that had previously been dominated by tourists or wealthy residents, or in abandoned neighborhoods of substandard housing. Some such neighborhoods have become known for nonstop partying, others have become studious university cities, and still others have been fixed up and turned into habitable artistic creations far more imaginative than anything produced by the professional artists of the capitalist regime. Universities are supported insofar as they are useful to the communities that produce the resources that keep them in operation. That means free education for any who seek it, and research that reflects the needs of the communities. Researchers who worked for big industries or developing war and policing technologies, from anthropologists to physicists, have been defrocked and ostracized from academic communities. A great deal of research focuses on climate adaptation and horizontal technologies. One major scientific intervention is the algae farms used to purify water in several major cities, and also used to produce a fast-growing, high-energy biofuel that, combined with carbon capture in the power plants, draws a significant amount of carbon out of the atmosphere. Another is the floating seaweed farms far out in the Mediterranean that help purify the water and also constitute a new food source. One variety of seaweed is added to the diets of sheep and cattle, drastically reducing the amount of methane they emit. Industry likewise has undergone a vast transformation corresponding to the needs of the communities that support them. Delinked from the global network of production in pursuit of accumulation, factories were either abandoned or taken over by their workers, and in the latter case, they were quickly repurposed to meet social needs. The principal forms of production that continue at an industrial scale are for medicines and medical supplies, textiles, and machine parts, though all of these are produced at a much lower volume. As such, most factories are only running a couple days a week, and the workers have also effectuated substantial changes to slow down the pace and increase worker comfort and safety. However, there is no need to ignore that factories are intrinsically designed to put the interests of machinery over the interests of their human attendants. This is no Stakhanovite socialism that prioritizes productivity and pretends that all attendant problems have been solved with a change in management. Factories continue to be nasty places. As such, those who still work in them are either those who feel an affinity for large machines or volunteers who put up with the noise and the artificial environment for a few days every month in order to produce things they want their communities to have access to. Regarding declining volumes in the 3 aforementioned categories, the reasons are fairly straightforward. Given that every person has access to a healthy and diverse diet and to preventive medicine, and that air and water pollution, food toxins, and repetitive stress injuries have dropped almost to zero, the major causes of death and disease under the capitalist regime have been largely eliminated. Practically the only reasons for surgical interventions and pharmaceuticals today are pre-existing conditions from the capitalist days: residual pollution, genetic disorders, tropical diseases spread by warming, and accidents. With the decline of synthetics, most textiles are made from flax, cotton, or wool. Textiles now are produced to a higher quality, so they last longer, and there has been a marked move away from the middle class ideal of expressing individuality through a large wardrobe. On the other hand, most clothes now are made in artisanal workshops using textiles from the factories, so fashion is in fact more individualized, often crafted by a friend or acquaintance, rather than mass-produced. As for machine parts, under capitalism they were made to break down and be thrown away, and nowadays they are made to last and, whenever possible, repaired. Machines that are frequently produced are those related to the textile and medical industries, those related to agriculture like oil presses or flour mills, hand tools, vehicles used in public transportation like buses and trains, and energy and communications infrastructure. Because industrial production decreased in volume so drastically, workers in different regions coordinate to complement one another and spread production out over a larger network. The point is to find a balance between decreasing the distance components need to be transported and spreading out the industrial infrastructure so that no one region has to host all the factories that would be needed to produce a train or radio transmitter from start to finish. As for inorganic raw materials like metals, the vast majority comes from scrapping and recycling. Social movements are pushing for a moratorium on mining, and the truth is that very few communities want mines in their own backyard. Fortunately, capitalism left a great deal of waste, so there is a relative abundance of raw materials already above ground. And a major area of scientific research in the last decade has been the development of synthetics that are neither toxic nor petroleum derivatives. Popular science, meanwhile, has honed the art of recycling and repurposing. Related to this trend, most production is carried out in small workshops that produce everything from clothes to bicycles to books to building materials. In such workshops, people can develop their creative and technical abilities in an environment that they shape, free to dawdle, experiment, and innovate as they build and design things that are useful to their communities. Unlike factories, the workshops are also able to carry out vital repair activities, keeping everything from jackets and shoes to motors and stoves in good order. Communications have undergone a major change, with rocket launches and thus satellites falling by the wayside. The night sky is gradually being reclaimed for stargazers. There is still a strong shared desire for global communication, and such a communication network is vital to adapting to global problems as well as spreading solidarity and overcoming conflict. Radio and telephone have regained a fair deal of currency, and internet is maintained through a combination of pre-existing fiber optic networks and newly deployed mesh networks or wireless wide area networks. Internet volume is significantly reduced, both due to the lower supply of electricity and because of the end of capitalist boredom. The biggest drivers of internet usage today are international friendships and the sharing of science and news articles. The new internet infrastructure is fully encrypted and as secure as possible, with no more data mining companies, no more government spies, No more seizures of servers. So far, the recycling of computer and phone hardware has been sufficient given falling demand, and the production of new replacement parts is pending scientific research into improved recycling techniques or synthetics, given the general moratorium on metals mining. The energy that powers the communications infrastructure, as well as the factories, workshops, hospitals, and transportation networks, comes from a variety of sources. Around the end of the capitalist regime, the breakdown of electricity production in Catalonia, the most populous of the Catalan countries, was roughly 12% from hydroelectric, 6% from wind energy, 4% from other renewables, 50% from nuclear, and 28% from combined cycle or cogeneration power plants, mostly using natural gas or biomass as the fuel source. All of these sources underwent major changes. Engineers at Catalonia's 2 nuclear power plants were convinced to bring the reactors offline on a schedule that would leave the smallest quantity of highly radioactive waste, meaning that the plants were still producing electricity for several years. Some combined cycle and cogeneration plants transitioned to burn biofuels, while most were shut down in the first year. Solar cells that were already produced before the end of capitalism were quickly redistributed where they were most needed. Industrial wind turbines were dismantled where they were deemed to be particularly harmful to migratory birds, or where local farmers demanded it. Others were left operational. As electricity needs are stabilized at a new low, biologists, geologists, and local communities are beginning to survey all the hydroelectric dams to determine which ones are most detrimental to river and mountain ecosystems, as a first step towards dismantling them. Biofuel power plants burn agricultural and residential residues. As electricity usage was brought down, no agricultural land had to be wasted growing fuel for power plants anymore. The plants are fitted with carbon capture systems. The resulting biochar is spread on the fields to improve soil quality or used for high carbon concrete and other building materials. On balance, the electricity grid in the Catalan countries generates negative carbon emissions thanks to the end of natural gas and petroleum and the drastic reduction of overall energy usage. Without that reduction, negative emissions would have been impossible, and food shortages would have been caused by extreme demand for biofuels. Electricity usage was brought down to less than a quarter of the consumption levels at the end of capitalism within a few years. Electricity consumed by industry and the service sector fell immediately with the end of the capitalist economy. Bringing down the electricity needs of the domestic sector required a more thorough transformation, as houses were modified to improve insulation and allow for more passive heating and cooling. Small-scale wind turbines and solar panels using tin-based perovskite cells and newer synthetic designs were installed on many rooftops, as well as solar skins on south-facing facades. Where space permits, these systems are plugged into kinetic and gravity batteries, as well as newer, even more ingenious ways of storing energy, thus eliminating the need for destructive chemical batteries and allowing residential blocks to unplug from the grid. This in turn allows the electrical grid to be more concentrated, reducing distribution loss. While train, metro, and bus networks run off the electricity grid, a small amount of biofuels are produced for farm tractors and trucks in rural regions where the public transportation infrastructure is non-existent. Secondary roads are maintained with gravel or high-carbon concrete, but the autopistas, interstates or motorways, have been left to degrade. Early on, many highway bridges were sabotaged to slow down the military mobilizations aimed at crushing the movements. Given those associations, militarism, car traffic, the fast life, people have been reticent to bring them back. A final important question is that of home heating and cooking. While electricity and passive solar are more common in denser urban areas, ever-improved stove designs made from recycled metals have proven revolutionary in small towns and rural areas. The stoves allow for cooking and heating, they filter out particle pollution, and they are designed to burn agricultural residues like almond shells and tree prunings, gathered branches and small logs. With tens of millions of olive, almond, apple, cherry, plum, orange, walnut, and other trees throughout the Catalan countries, such residues are abundant. So what does your territory look like in a happier future? And how does it connect with the one I just described? One thing I want to make clear is that my proposal is not for a specific vision or final state, but for a method of producing futures. If, for example, you favor responses to the ecological crisis that center more horizontal, situated technologies, that which capitalism does not recognize as technology, or more engineered interventionist technologies, that's fine. The point is not to build a consensus around a blueprint, an impossible proposition on a global scale. Rather, the point is to situate ourselves in a territory, to converse and build relationships with that territory and its other inhabitants, to defend ourselves against those who would annihilate or exploit us, and with all the others grow into something healthier. The vision I describe above is somewhere between my ideal, moderated as a best case scenario departing from the current hell, and an acknowledgement of where other people are coming from and what they are likely to fight for. In other words, my ideal contains the ideals of other people that are contradictory to my own. As an anarchist, I want to live in a communism inhabited by other people, not by drones towing the party line. Justice and reconciliation, making sure mass murder doesn't pay. As we have seen throughout this book, the ecological crisis is not a future problem. It is with us right now. Every year, millions of people are being killed and dozens of species are going extinct due to the actions of powerful people and institutions. A fundamental part of any realistic response to the ecological crisis is to confront these injustices and take on questions of reparations and reconciliation. How do we deal with those responsible? How do we make up for the harm caused? How do we keep these oppressions from being perpetuated? Powerful institutions frequently talk of accountability, but it is clear that destroying the planet and its inhabitants is still a richly rewarded activity. To name just one recent example, the CEO of multinational Rio Tinto was forced to resign in a show of contrition after his company was caught destroying 46,000-year-old Aboriginal sacred sites belonging to the Puutukunti Kuruma and Pinikura peoples in Australia in the course of iron mining. Yet he was simultaneously lavished with an $18.6 million payout, doubled the previous year. Concepts like human rights, self-determination, legal process, and redress of grievances are codified into the current global system. Since the end of World War II, there have been numerous official attempts to correct episodes of extreme oppression and brutal atrocities. Nonetheless, the atrocities carried out by the most powerful actors are never punished, and even those injustices that are called to account tend to continue after cosmetic changes. In this era, when climate justice is a buzzword, that means we need to be every bit as cautious toward institutions that engage with processes of reconciliation as we are towards those that remain silent. A review of some historically significant processes of reconciliation, reparation, and punishment might at least help us identify useful and counterproductive elements for the road ahead. The archetypal process can be found in the Nuremberg trials of 1945 to 1949, a key moment in the development of international law in the post-war period. Some 200 defendants were charged with war crimes at Nuremberg, with the main trial against the leaders of the Nazi regime resulting in 19 convictions with 12 death sentences and 3 acquittals. For the most part, those convicted were political and military leaders responsible for the execution of civilians and prisoners of war. Plundering, not respecting the property rights of conquered populations, was another thing the Nuremberg judges and prosecutors took quite seriously. The systematic acts of genocide perpetrated by the Nazis entered the trials only tangentially, though genocide as a legal concept was developed in response, with much legal wrangling between the US and the USSR, of course, to keep their preferred forms of genocide out of the definition. A couple of defendants in the main trial bear examining. Karl Dönitz was the leader of the German Navy, and he was convicted of unrestricted naval warfare, meaning the slaughter of tens of thousands of civilians on the open seas. But he was not punished for that offense because the U.S. military had done the same thing. Here we can identify an early limitation of this model of international courts preserving human rights. Like political power, judicial power flows from the barrel of a gun, and any effective court requires the backing of a government, and with it, a military. Today, the International Criminal Court, ICC, in The Hague, can only apply its legal standards to countries that have bowed to the military dominance of its backers, primarily NATO. This is why it can prosecute and imprison war criminals from Serbia and Uganda, but it is utterly useless for responding to human rights abuses in Jerusalem or Los Angeles. With the unequal application of punishment, that which is not punished is normalized. So the kinds of abuses systematically carried out by the court's political military backers become invisible or acceptable. In this sense, the statist punitive model can make things worse. This international inequality also parallels the racism of criminal justice within a country. Those who are punished are portrayed as thugs from marginalized territories. Harm, therefore, is not what is carried out by the powerful. The Netherlands, which hosts the ICC, will never have to answer for the many genocidal acts it carried out, trying to hold on to its colonies. We are instead taught to look for harm coming from lower down the hierarchy, whether these are racialized inner cities on a domestic scale, countries in the process of Europeanization, as in the Balkans, or countries on the global margins, like Uganda. Hans Fritsch was another defendant in the main trial at Nuremberg and one of the few who was acquitted. He was the head of the news division of the Nazi propaganda service. The Nazis could not have achieved any of what they did without an effective news service, but one of the specific ways that liberal regimes achieve social control is through the alienation of ideas and actions. Media companies are therefore free to organize genocide and oppression on an ideological terrain, and should even be congratulated in the process for promoting free debate. An example of this principle in practice, the New York Times played a crucial role in preparing the U.S. invasion of Iraq, responsible for the widespread distribution of information that we knew at the time was false. The fact that not only did the editors suffer no consequences for their direct complicity in over 1 million deaths, but that most people still take the publication seriously shows a further harm that can be caused by the principles enshrined at Nuremberg. Another implicit principle established at Nuremberg is that mass murder is acceptable if it is a result of the pursuit of profit and not the direct objective of whomever carries it out. By and large, the American and British architects of Nuremberg protected German bankers and industrialists from prosecution. There were only 3 trials to target German industrialists, those against the Flick Group, IG Farben, and Krupp. These were largely symbolic trials, and what was being prosecuted was primarily these companies' use of slave labor and their plundering of the property of conquered populations. In other words, not respecting the property laws that were standard in other industrialized nations. The fact of profiting off a genocidal regime was not put on trial. After all, many North American, British, and French companies also profited under Nazi rule. In the first 2 cases, about half the defendants were acquitted, and those who were convicted got short sentences, with the longest at 8 years. In the Krupp trial, against the company largely responsible for arming the German military, the longest sentence was 12 years. But after 2.5 years, they were all released, and control of the company was even returned to Alfred Krupp. The attitude of the New World leaders toward the atrocities of World War II went beyond tolerance. The U.S. recruited and relocated over 1,600 Nazi scientists and technicians who would be militarily useful in the Cold War. For their part, the Soviet Union relocated 2,200 specialists, also looking for advantage. Many of these had participated in unspeakable acts, and all of them had supported the Nazi drive for conquest. What were the favorable consequences of Nuremberg? The fact of severely punishing at least some of those responsible, the fact that death camp guards had to go on the run and were sometimes imprisoned when caught, even though they were simply following orders, helped bring about a change in society. Though our understanding of human rights is contradictory and full of double standards, there is at least an attempt to place human rights before the duty of obedience to authority. The effectiveness of this change can be seen in its omissions. Those forms of complicity with atrocities that were forgiven at Nuremberg are some of the most frequent ways that atrocities are carried out today, encouraging the worldviews that make such atrocities inevitable, profiting off of them, causing harm for the sake of scientific progress, or allowing harm to occur through bureaucratic processes that do not at any stage require someone to pull a trigger or flip a lever. Meanwhile, the more blunt methods of the Einsatzgruppen, the death squads, are discouraged outside of zones of exception, territories pushed outside the pale of civilization by the war on terror, or colonial geographies of dispossession that condemn certain regions as naturally violent. As for anti-Semitism, though it was barely addressed at Nuremberg, it became a focus of subsequent prosecutions and judicial processes. Anti-Semitism is still a major danger today, but support for it has decreased substantially in much of Europe, and even right-wing parties usually have to mute such discourses. Punishment of the perpetrators of the Holocaust and the reparation of wealth stolen from Jewish people by the Nazis is a factor in this change. Again, we can measure the change by looking at the omissions. In the mainstream, the very low figure of 6 million victims is frequently given for the Holocaust, omitting, among many others, Roma and Sinti victims. Across the board, these populations have been given scant attention. The result? Throughout Europe, politicians can openly advocate for institutional or vigilante violence against these communities with no consequences. Mainstream media systematically talk about them in racist ways, and in the 1990s and 2000s, Germany and France deported thousands of Roma to Romania and Bulgaria, and in Germany as well as Romania, they have been subjected to lethal lynchings. Incidentally, mass deportation is one of the offending criteria listed in legal definitions of genocide, and was certainly an important precursor action during the Holocaust. On balance, a punitive legal response to genocide has had mixed results. Social values have shifted, and there is widespread support for the sentiment of never again, but the kinds of atrocities carried out by the authorities who doled out the punishment have become normalized. Currently, no one is talking about punishing those who are responsible for the ecological crisis and all the death that has gone with it. At most, there are proposals of fining fossil fuel companies, but this is not a punishment. This is simply not letting them profit quite as much from all the misery they cause. So let us entertain the idea of actually holding them responsible. The execution of Nazi leaders is one of the least controversial acts of justice in history, even among those who oppose the death penalty. Yet suggesting that oil company executives should be executed for knowingly causing tens of millions of deaths, profiting off it, and obstructing social and legal responses will strike many people as horrific and disproportionate. By definition, punitive justice is winner's justice. People today whose survival is currently guaranteed by racial capitalism will go along like good citizens with this chain of atrocities that in terms of scale is at least one order of magnitude more lethal than World War II. Many of them will agree with the newscasters and the politicians who warn of the twin dangers of fascist and anti-fascist extremists, and then later, after watching the latest historical documentary, will ask themselves how so many good Germans could have let the Holocaust happen. And yet, inevitably, whether 10 or 100 years from now, when most people recognize that today's politicians, millionaires, industry leaders, and many scientists as well, were in fact mass murderers, they will play the facile ethical game of asking whether it would be hypothetically justified to go back in time to kill some of these monsters, if it might make a difference in affecting the course of history. This is another aspect of punitive justice. It takes the pursuit of justice out of our hands and turns us into spectators. And when we cannot right the wrongs we see are all around us, the typical response is to stop seeing them. I would argue that these politicians and millionaires have no inviolable worth after everything they have done, and that directing our rage against them is in fact a healthy and just response. However, following an anarchist ethics, I would warn against looking to Nuremberg, not for their sake, but for ours. And this is because any group of people who organize the systematic punishment of their enemies inevitably become monsters, no matter how monstrous those they are punishing are. Now, let us look at justice processes that partially or completely removed the option of punishment from the very beginning. The most famous of these is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, TRC, of South Africa, in which offenders from any side were promised amnesty if they came forward and confessed to the atrocities they had carried out. Some 20,000 people were identified as victims of human rights abuses, with 3,000 victims identified due to applications for amnesty by the perpetrators. The purpose of this process was to prioritize getting the truth about what happened, and also to move on in a spirit of forgiveness. The focus of this process was on the final few decades of bloody repression of the anti-apartheid movement. One problem with such a focus is that it leaves out the greater context, that of 3 centuries of bloody colonization by the Dutch and British, and widespread land theft by the Boers. At the end of the process, South Africa still had to beg for IMF loans, while British capitalists still speculated internationally with unimaginable wealth derived in large part from colonialism. White Boers still controlled much of the best lands and owned mines and profitable infrastructure, while many blacks still lived in extreme poverty. And when these impoverished inhabitants rise up in protest, as they did in the Soweto township, to bring the apartheid regime to an end, police are still sent in to shoot them, although now many of those cops are black. In other words, there were no real reparations, and the shift in power relations was minimal. The apartheid government got to determine the conditions for its departure. Quote, success in the constitutional negotiations depended to a large degree on making a deal with the previous regime, end quote. And the, quote, minions of apartheid, quote, still dominated the police, army, and civil service, end quote. A new class of black politicians entered the political elite, and thanks to good old-fashioned corruption, some of them got to enter the lower strata of the economic elite, which remains largely white. Perhaps more importantly, South Africa remains plugged into all the structures of global capitalism that arose over the course of European colonization of the world. The representational politics of having black political leaders serves to obscure these power relations more than to change them. What about the goal of learning the truth within the narrow focus on repression in the final decades of apartheid? Many families did get to learn specifically how their loved ones died, which is invaluable. And the hearings were designed in a way to honor and center the victims, rather than centering the dispensers of the law, as in a courtroom. I cannot help but think, though, that the narrative of learning the truth of what happened is facile, more for the benefit of the so-called international community, or for researchers desiring solid documentation. Can anyone doubt that in Soweto, in Sharpeville, people knew exactly the truth of the situation, even if they did not know the specific date, the specific police station, where their neighbors were killed, or exactly who gave the order to open fire on their protest. Furthermore, the Commission's framing encouraged a pernicious both-sidesism, that cynical liberal maneuver of insisting that both sides in a conflict committed regrettable acts. While interpersonal conflicts often do display a dynamic whereby each person's errors aggravate and impel a further round of errors, and therefore the both sides portrayal appeals to common sense, it rarely scales up. In a clear case of oppressor and oppressed, framing the extreme acts that the oppressed carry out to win their freedom as comparable to the extreme acts oppressors do to foreclose that freedom is nothing but support for oppression. The British and Dutch did not stumble over into South Africa innocently, and they did not begin plundering the locals because the South Africans had caused them any offense. The TRC did try to break with the victor's justice of Nuremberg. They can be lauded for recognizing that the ends do not justify the means, as ends and means are inseparable. And yet, while movements for liberation do need to be wary of adopting oppressive tactics themselves, that this should happen in dialogue with their oppressors only erases the reality of the situation they fought against. Furthermore, the principle of proportionality established by the TRC considered it more justifiable for apartheid agents to assassinate blacks involved in armed resistance than those who remained peaceful. On balance, the South African model is interesting because it helps us imagine a format for justice based on sharing stories and creating paths for healing. But more than that, I believe it serves as a cautionary tale for how oppressive institutions can easily recuperate subversive ideas and hollow them out. Ultimately, there can be no healing if the power relations at the root of the oppression are not fixed. And time and again, we have seen that representational politics are not capable of changing oppressive power relations, but on the contrary, work in their service. For me, the final word is that most black survivors of apartheid were not content with the TRC, and many shared the sentiment, no reconciliation without reparation. In Guatemala, the Historical Clarification Commission, CEH, of 1995 through 1997 studied the genocide against Mayan peoples that occurred during the 36-year Civil War and resulted in over 200,000 deaths, with many more tortured, raped, and injured. Appointed by the United Nations, the Commission did not have the authority to carry out prosecutions, and its findings were barred from having judicial repercussions. Rather, its mandate was to make recommendations and to investigate and document the genocide. Purportedly, the goal was to establish the truth of what happened in order to allow for healing, but this seems like a whitewash, as the Commission was prohibited from naming names or attributing responsibility. Restitution for victims of the genocide was paid from a minuscule fund set aside by the Guatemalan government and was characterized by recipients as symbolic or miserable. A small number of military leaders and commandos were eventually prosecuted, though few sentences are actually being applied. It is perhaps significant that the principal architect of the framework of international law represented by the United Nations, and thus the CEH, the United States, benefited from and helped to organize the Civil War and attendant genocide. The CIA, U.S. Army, and corporations like the United Fruit Company worked with the European-descended Guatemalan elite to launch a coup and carry out a genocidal war against those who resisted. in order to maintain control and continue reaping windfall profits from the extractive economy. The CEH did nothing to change the dispossession of Mayan peoples in Guatemala, nor to end the predatory relationship the U.S. government and corporations maintain with Latin America. Canada also got on the reconciliation bandwagon after a 2006 legal agreement admitted the widespread genocidal practices of residential schools, by which the government kidnapped and abused Indigenous youth and attempted to eradicate their language and culture from the 19th century through the 1990s. Simultaneous to waving a flag of peace and healing, the Trudeau government continued aggressively pushing extractivist projects on First Nations land. In this context, Michif Cree feminist and anarchist Tawinike criticizes the concept of reconciliation as, quote, a state-led smokescreen used to advance a more sophisticated policy of assimilation, end quote. In Tawinike's words, official Canadian reconciliation centers on accepting the past, apologizing, and moving forward together. It doesn't necessitate physical reparations for the history of colonization. In fact, it discourages that sort of rhetoric as divisive, counterproductive, difficult. There exists a fundamental problem here. Because settler colonialism doesn't exist in the past, its violence is pervasive and ongoing right now, tonight, everywhere we look. Reconciliation is the erasure of this current settler colonial violence. Reconciliation, as a term, is about resolving a conflict, returning to a state of friendly relations. It can also mean the bringing together of two positions so as to make them compatible. Decolonization, on the other hand, is about repealing the authority of the colonial state and redistributing land and resources. It also means embracing and legitimizing previously repressed Indigenous worldviews. Decolonization isn't a light word. We have to think about what colonization is to understand it. The complete administrative and economic domination of a people and a place. Repealing that is a big deal. Nevertheless, you will often see these two words thrown around almost interchangeably, especially in the university context, where folks using them aren't actually actors in struggle. I would argue that this is inappropriate. Canada was created in order to govern, exploit, and expand the territories swindled, settled, and stolen from Indigenous peoples of this land. That wasn't a byproduct, it was its primary function. It still is. It always will be. It can't escape that. So how can the Canadian state reconcile with Indigenous peoples? They certainly can't go back to a state of friendly relations because there never existed such a time. Reconciliation can only mean eliminating the conflict by enmeshing Indigenous and settler communities, which is the second version of that definition that I shared, making conflicting positions compatible. This means assimilating Indigenous peoples by having them give up their claim to sovereignty in exchange for the promise of economic equality within Canada. And it means Canadian people get to devour Indigenous ideas and symbols into their own settler stories, their own Canadiana. This is the only path possible under the Canadian state. Point 7 of Canada's 10 points of official reconciliation says that consultation is an aspiration, but that the control of lands supposedly held by Indigenous peoples can be overridden in any situation beneficial to the state of Canada. Indigenous peoples, even under the banner of reconciliation, do not have the right to say no to the state of Canada. The right to say no is critical to the realization of sovereignty, of consent, of freedom. End of Tuinuke citation. This devastating critique underscores what we have seen in the failings of institutional attempts to achieve justice. There can be no justice if the power relations that generated oppression and unleashed atrocities are not dismantled. With regard to settler societies, Tuinuke suggests that we could speak of reconciliation between Indigenous and settlers when we abolish capitalism in the state. Quote, the new relationship to place and focus on interdependence will give settlers a chance to genuinely form a new connection to this land themselves, end quote. No justice will be forthcoming if we do not acknowledge that the ecological crisis is victimizing hundreds of millions of people right now, and that the non-human victims of this crisis are also worthy of being remembered, protected, and where possible, avenged. Apocalyptic utopias now. Present steps in the networking of local and global spaces. The alternative to ecocide is not a simplistic plan for carbon reduction on a schedule that will not be met, and even if it were, could not avert a catastrophe that is already upon us. The alternative is the networking of thousands of empowered territories, each one approaching the horizon of a complex imagined future that prioritizes the health and happiness of that territory and its inhabitants. To achieve that, we do not have to await the timetables of economists and engineers advising us how to incentivize powerful, murderous institutions to make the needed changes at their own pace without rocking the boat too much. What we need to do instead is to find the seeds of those empowered territories all around us, nurture them, cultivate them, and link them in a rhizomatic web that will become stronger than any institution of the ecocidal system that is already falling to ruin. Strong enough so that as many of our living communities as possible, human and non-human, all enmeshed, will survive the upheavals and disturbances as our planet tries to heal from centuries of abuse. Finding those seeds, cultivating them, will look different in every territory. But after talking with friends across the world, I think we can trace an outline for action that will be useful in different contexts by asking ourselves 4 simple questions. These questions, in conversation with those around us, can be an important step in creating empowered communities. Who is already fighting? What seedlings do we have? What risks do we face? Who can we help? When we look around us to see who is already fighting, we are looking for accomplices and also breaking with the mentality of passively awaiting solutions. And by fighting, I mean struggling for survival in the broadest sense of the term. Survival is never individual. It is communal. It is physical, emotional, and intergenerational. It includes people trying to stop a pipeline that would poison their water supply, to stop an airport that would bring in floods of tourists and destroy their traditional relation with their territory. People trying to preserve their language or their heirloom crops against pressures to modernize. People fighting against evictions or trash incinerators, trying to create a more livable city. People crossing borders in search of a better life. Fighting for survival does not include people launching careers off their activism. It does not include people developing and patenting technologies that, taken out of context, might seem to make a small part of the problem better, but in the current context will just concentrate more wealth into fewer hands. Taking inventory of our seedlings means identifying sources of strength that have shown to be viable right now, and that with more support might grow exponentially, serving as inspirations or starting points for a new way of living, like a weed that breaks the pavement or the first generation tree that makes way for a thriving forest. Maybe we take part in a labor organization that might be able to launch infrastructures of international solidarity in a moment of deepening crisis. Maybe we live in a territory that has remained relatively fertile, with a good number of projects that point the way to local food sovereignty. Or maybe we live in a desertifying area, but take part in projects that help the local ecosystem and human communities to adapt and mitigate the damage. Maybe we run a hacking collective or open technology initiative capable of sharing useful tools and designs on a global scale. Maybe our region has a combative street movement capable of wrecking capitalist infrastructure projects or blocking government policies that threaten us. What links can we establish between projects, and what conversations can we have within these projects in order to let more people know they serve as a model for a better world and to be ready when they need to grow rapidly and pull more weight? We also need to be aware of what specific risks we face in our territory. Do we live in a food desert? How far away are food and fuel supplies should the gas stations and supermarkets go empty? What infrastructures do we lack for growing and processing our own food? What repressive strategies and capabilities is the local government likely to use against us? And what kind of organized paramilitary forces exist in our territory? Are we at acute risk of desertification, wildfires, sea level rise, or tropical diseases? Do we have access to the seeds that we will need for next year's planting, or are they all warehoused by agribusiness? How do the people around us react to crisis? When the pandemic hit, did they rush to empty out the stores, or did they think of ways to protect one another? Finally, who can we help? What living communities, human and non-human, in our territory are most at risk, most in need of additional resources in order to adapt and protect themselves? What infrastructures and resources do we have, especially considering those given to us by global capitalism, that people in other territories lack? How can we build bonds of communication and solidarity with those other territories so we can help them get what they need to survive? Where we live and who we are will result in very different answers to these questions. No institution on the planet is capable of assimilating all those knowledges in an intelligent way. It is up to us to answer these questions and create our own plans. It might help to suggest a few lines of inquiry relating to the most basic, broad differences. People from colonized territories have different historical and present examples to look for, deciding how to take charge of their calls for solidarity, the way they build support, and the way they understand reparations. The Zapatistas and the Kurdish Liberation Movement both put out calls for international solidarity and received important material and moral support. Key elements of their campaigns included inviting supporters to their territories to learn firsthand about their struggles, defining how people from outside could support them, and thus eliminating one of the most central and oppressive characteristics of charity, asking those supporters to bring their experiences back to a significantly larger group of people in their home territories, and to build support there, and challenging and influencing the ideologies of liberation movements in colonizing countries. Especially in the case of the Zapatistas, there was also an important element of asking people in wealthier countries to raise money and help the local communities achieve the material basis for autonomy, in contradiction to the forced dependence of global capitalism. Other examples include the Solidarity campaign that targeted companies doing business with the South African apartheid regime with boycott or sabotage, including an extensive firebombing campaign in Germany and the Netherlands that forced multiple companies to divest, or international solidarity with Palestine, focusing on boycotts, divestment, and sanctions. On a smaller scale, but very recently, there was the call put out by First Nations fighting against land grabs in territories occupied by the Canadian state to help blockade transportation infrastructure in the midst of a powerful wave of protests that shut down highways, ports, and rail lines across the country. To simplify, salient questions include how to communicate the needs of the colonized territory, how to build international relationships strong enough to provide a framework for real solidarity, and how to self-define the struggle and break the habits of paternalism and charity that people from colonizing societies are trained in. A series of articles by John Severino, all available on the anarchistlibrary.org, detail one model for creating international solidarity based on creating and collectivizing personal relationships between communities in struggle, in this case between anarchists and indigenous communities within the United States, Bolivia, and Chile. For our part, people from colonizing countries might want to consider recent critiques of allyship, such as, quote, accomplices not allies, end quote, by Indigenous Action Media, or, quote, critique of ally politics, end quote. Breaking with paternalistic charity models is fundamental. If we are not learning from the people we are supporting, it isn't solidarity. But there are other pitfalls as well. Tawinake speaks to one of them. Quote, saying you support Indigenous sovereignty doesn't mean backing every Indigenous person on every project. There are plenty of Indigenous misogynists and ladder-climbing politicians out there, and you don't do me any favors by helping them gain power. Fight for liberatory ideas, not for nations or bloodlines. We do this all the time. There are Indigenous people out there who oppose pipelines and those who support them. But we align ourselves with the resistance, so we are making choices already. Own it. It's okay. It's good to fight for the land and for freedom. Understand what struggles are about and know who is participating in them. Get to know those people. Build relationships. Build meaningful relationships outside of the occupation, as friends. It can't start from a place of white guilt. Don't get swept up in your own settler redemption story, end quote. As for the imperative of rooting ourselves in a territory, this can be extremely difficult if we have no such roots to start with. If we come from a culture that has been completely modernized, and especially if we are settlers in a settler state, unless they are well thought out in historical perspective and with great sensitivity to all the other living communities around us, attempts to, quote, reconnect with our roots, end quote, will only end up reproducing alienation. Knowing the land is resistance, the link is https://knowingtheland.com, provides an interesting model for an initiative by settlers living, quote, between Lake Ontario and the Niagara Escarpment, end quote, to learn from and connect with local woodlands, to spread ecological skills and awareness with plant walks, seed harvesting, zines, and workshops, to develop an anarchist ecology that critiques, quote, the ecology of management from a distance and of remote expertise that sees itself as fundamentally separate from the land, inhabiting a present without a past or future, end quote, and instead offers, quote, starting points for an anti-colonial, anti-authoritarian way of connecting with the land that is rooted in relationships, deep listening, urban ecology, re-enchanting, and unexpertness, end quote, and to build active solidarity with ongoing Indigenous struggles to defend and recover their land and their ways of life. Because of a history we did not create, but must nonetheless situate ourselves within, settlers need to make clear that it is more important for us to defend the land than to own it. This means sabotaging destructive infrastructure and helping block ecocidal megaprojects without the expectation that doing so will win us ownership or some other claim to the land. Plenty of past projects that arose from European socialism and focused on reclaiming a connection with the land became complicit with colonialism when carried out in a settler context, including Zionist kibbutzim such as Degania or Sointula, a commune set up by Finnish socialists on the territory of the Namgis First Nation, usurped within the confines of British Columbia. As for specific considerations for Indigenous and racialized people moving forward, of course, I'm not qualified to offer any. But I hope that the revolutionaries, communities, organizations, and initiatives that have also spoken in these pages can provide inspiration relevant to many different contexts. One thing that I think is true wherever we are is that we can get to know the earth beneath our feet, the history that towers behind us, the overlapping communities that surround us. Wherever we live, there we can find life, and with life, struggle. Let us connect on that basis and fight for a world fit for living things, not for the ossified institutions begging us to save them, to rejuvenate them again with one more round of life-sapping reforms. Capitalism is dying. It has been dying for a very long time, and still it keeps growing. Colonialism has already changed its masks. The state has stood on the precipice of collapse before. Why keep pretending? Why bite our tongues? Let us put them out of their misery before it is too late for all of us. We don't need them. There is another world right here. It has been with us the whole time. This is the end of The Solutions Are Already Here, Strategies for Ecological Revolution from Below by Peter Gelderloos.
This has been a production of Audible Anarchist. You can find more Audible Anarchist on YouTube.